Hey everybody, this is Neil Pasricha, and welcome back to chapter 61 of 3 books. Yes, you are listening to our epic 14-year-long countdown to uncover and discuss the world's 1,000 most formative books. We are ranging all over the place, near, far, high, low, up, down, trying to talk to some of the most inspiring people in the world and ask each of them which 3 books most shaped their lives. Remember when we flew down to Key West, Florida, when we sat down with Judy Bloom in chapter 6 in her bookstore, Books and Books? Shout out to Books and Books. We love independent bookstores on this show. Or do you guys remember when we hung out with Elder Cox and Elder Corona, 2 teenage Mormon missionaries, talked to them about purpose and the challenges of religion in chapter 36? Or do you remember when we hung out with Vivek Shreya back in chapter 53 on trashing traditional trans tropes with the artist, the queer artist of color, as she identifies herself, Vivek Shreya, and her incredible book, including the book I'm Afraid of Men. And now, today, chapter 61, I am delighted to bring you a conversation with the one and only Temple Grandin. So much to say about Temple Grandin. Who is Temple Grandin? Well, Temple Grandin was born in 1947 in Boston. She was diagnosed with autism as a child, but quite late, I guess, relative to when you could get diagnosed as autism back in the 1950s. It wasn't until she was 4 that she began to speak. Her mother, Harvard educated, depicted in a wonderful movie called Temple Grandin by HBO Films, worked tirelessly to help Temple become educated. They gave, extra help, extra learning, people were brought in to help her study and to train. And eventually she opened up and blossomed into the Temple Grandin we know and love today. Got her bachelor's degree, got her master's degree, got her PhD, animal science, went down to Arizona, comes out, guess what? She's brought to prominence in the world by a 1995 book written by Oliver Sacks called An Anthropologist on Mars, which is derived from Temple Grandin's description of how she feels in social settings. In the 60s, 70s, 80s, the autism diagnosis was typically came with like a recommendation to be institutionalized. Temple Grandin received that recommendation as well. Her parents did not agree over it. Her mom kind of won out, so she was not institutionalized, but she became one of the most prominent and leading and first spokespeople ever for the autistic community. She has since gone on to become a huge advocate for autism, has written books, including Thinking in Pictures, her memoir, as well as The Autistic Brain, Helping Different Kinds of Minds Succeed. Temple Grandin is also a huge spokesperson in the animal community. How does she work in animal welfare? Well, she is prominent for her design of slaughterhouses. Might seem counterintuitive. We are going to explore that on this show. How does someone who's sort of known for animal rights design slaughterhouses? Well, she has written a famous essay called Animals Are Not Things. And while she argues that animals are technically property in our society, the law ultimately grants them certain key protections. She followed it up with other successful books like Animals in Translation and Animals Make Us Human, which have garnered a lot of critical acclaim. Of course, Temple Grandin's willingness to work with fast food companies and other slaughterhouse owners is controversial within the animal rights communities. In her case, in her book, she makes the case that alleviating anxiety rather than extending life fully should be the priority for those keeping animals. There is so much to say about Temple Grandin. She was, as I mentioned, depicted in the award-winning 2010 film called Temple Grandin, which has 100% in Rotten Tomatoes. Starred Claire Danes as Temple Grandin and won 15 awards, including Emmy Awards, Screen Actors Guild Awards, and Golden Globe Awards. It's like a hugely award-winning movie. She also gave a very famous TED Talk called The World Needs All Kinds of Minds at TED, the big TED, the real TED, the actual TED in 2010, which at the time of me reading this has 5,757,980 views. A wonderful, beautiful, incredible TED Talk. Whether it's the TED Talk, whether it's the books, whether it's the movie, you probably or maybe have heard of Temple Grandin. But what you may not know, what I didn't know, is which 3 books helped shape who she is. What are the ethics of eating meat? How do we nurture diverse minds? What's missing from the education system today? And what are Temple Grandin's 3 most formative books. Thank you so much for listening. And now let's jump in to the conversation. Let's go. Hi, Temple.
Hi, how are you?
I'm great. How is... you know, it's so funny. You said, hi, how are you? I guess maybe just because Leslie and I just watched Temple Grandin, the movie, I was expecting you to say, hi, Temple Grandin. Nice to meet you. Like just the way Claire Danes does as you, like about 10 times in the movie. Do you still... I guess the way I took it from the movie was that was sort of like a script you had learned as a child to introduce yourself.
Well, people with autism sort of learn phrases. I used to get bullied a whole lot when I was in high school, and people used to call me tape recorder because I'd keep using the same phrases. Now, the more and more stuff you learn, then you can use phrases that's going to be less and less like a tape recorder. Bullying was horrible for me in high school, and the only places I was not bullied is where I was with a shared interest with somebody else, with another student, maybe doing electronics or model rockets or horseback riding. Those were refuges away from teasing and bullying.
I'm so sorry about the bullying and the, tape recorder as a phrase. It might sound, simple or innocuous compared to me. I have 4 eyes, occasionally Packy, as I'm brown, but very rarely called sort of a racist name. And although I heard it, a few times, but I know the pain of that. And the idea of scripting a response was so appealing to me. I don't believe I am autistic at all, but I think to myself, I probably do scripted responses a lot. Even just how I start any conversation or finish any conversation. For your mind, and you've been so open about your mind over the years, thinking in pictures, your famous TED Talk and so on. How does that feel to try to learn a new script? Or you've said so many times, I think in pictures, I don't think in words. How does somebody learn a script? What does learning a script feel like for you?
Well, and I'm seeing now childhood images of how I was taught when my mother had a party, that when the guests came, I greeted them at the door. And I knew the first names of the Woods. They were Holty and Vivi. I was not allowed to call them that. They were Mr. and Mrs. Wood. And I was instructed to walk up and say, good evening, Mr. Wood, and shake their hand. Good evening, Mrs. Wood, and shake her hand.
And what I saw in the movie with Leslie, my wife, and it's an incredible movie, 100% on Rotten Tomatoes. For those that haven't seen it, winner of so many Emmy Awards, Screen Actors Guild Awards for Claire Danes' performance and the story of your life. Whenever your character's shown in the movie, it flashes in like 2 seconds all the images of say all the shoes you've seen in your whole life. And so you just shared openly with us. So your mind flashes backwards in sort of a photographic way. It sounds like all the times you might have mastered a script or met somebody new. Is that what's happening?
Well, every thought is a picture. And if you say a word that doesn't have much meaning, like I'm seeing a third grade reading book, because those words are connector words. They don't have very much meaning. And now with all those shoes flashing up there, I can stop that, so that shoes just don't keep flashing up there. But what tends to happen when you ask me about something is I bring up recent memories or old memories. And if you want to kind of learn how my mind works, why don't you give me a keyword, pretend I'm Google for images. But make sure it's not something that's going to be in my house. Think up something original to be a keyword that I would not see sitting here at a computer.
Sure. I will say dolphin.
Dolphin? Well, I'm seeing dolphins at SeaWorld. I'm seeing dolphins that Diana Reese was working with. I'm seeing an experiment that Diana Reese did where a dolphin looked at himself in the mirror and he recognized himself.
Wow.
Now
keep going. This is fascinating.
The dolphin and let's say they splash water on you. So now I'm seeing running through the sprinkler when I'm a child. Now I'm seeing the next door neighbor's little kid running through a sprinkler. So that's how I got from dolphin to sprinklers.
And now let me keep going. I want to try one more with you just to play the experiment further. And you're so open about your mind, and you're one of the first people in the world who's been so public about their autism. And I wanted to ask you about that later, but let's just say I switch a different word, and I'm making it up on the top of my head. How about volcano?
Well, I'm seeing a trip to Hawaii that I did with my student Jennifer about 20 years ago. We went to Hawaii, and we could actually see part of an active volcano. And I remember driving down this road, and the magma was maybe 2 foot deep black magma, and it all hardened and was cold. And the road, it had covered up the road, and we drove up to where, as far as we could go, and then there was this lava just on top of the road, and a white stripe just disappeared into the hardened lava. So I'm seeing that. That's the first picture that came up. And then when you stood on the hardened lava, you could see the volcano off in the distance.
Now, you have spoken about how autism is a spectrum, and I know that phrase, autism is a spectrum, is one that I'm sure many people listening to 3 Books right now have heard before. A couple things. What type of autism do you have? How common is it compared to the other types of autism? And do you still feel it's a spectrum today? And I'm asking, we just recently had a podcast with David Mitchell on this show, and his son has autism. He translated a famous book called The Reason I Jump, which you may have heard of.
Yes, I'm very familiar with that book, and also the sequel to The Reason I Jump.
Yeah.
I really, really like the sequel because Noki's older, and he gives a lot more insights.
Right. Fall down 7 times, get up 8. So the translator, David Mitchell, and his wife, we just had David on the show.
Okay.
But tell me more about type of autism you have, how we think about the spectrum today. Because when I think spectrum, I'm sort of picturing a ruler where on one side you've got, I don't know, Asperger's, I'm making it up. And the other side you've got nonverbal. I know that's not right, what I just said, but I'm having trouble picturing it. And of course, as there are so many people in our lives, say, that have autism, how do we think about it? And where does your type of autism fit?
Basically, Silicon Valley programmers, they've got mild autism. He's socially a bit geeky, a bit socially awkward. You're on the real mild end of the autism spectrum where there's no speech delay. The Asperger's, which they've taken out of the DSM, which I don't agree with taking that out, but that's what they did.
What's a DSM?
The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's the American Psychiatric Association Handbook for Diagnosis.
Right. If it's in the book, it's real. If it's not in the book, it's not. It's a version of not classified the same way. Is that right?
Some of this, I tell people that the DSM is half science and half doctors in little conference room meetings squabbling. Now
exactly.
The little web seminars squabbling.
Yeah. So you would say that the Silicon Valley programmer who has mild Asperger's, geeky, socially awkward, you would say technically they're autistic, but they're not in the book anymore. And I love the way you sort of trash the community, because you're like, hey, it's just not in the book. Doesn't mean it's not real. But yeah, we as a society use the phrase autism to mean many different things. So I'm curious I want you to keep going and keep expanding our view of what the word autism means. Keep going. Autism
basically is you can be kind of geeky and socially awkward to being nonverbal. Then there's some individuals that are nonverbal that have other medical problems on top of it, such as epilepsy. And they've got the spectrum so broad now that from a service provider standpoint and from an educator provider standpoint, it's not a good situation. Now let's look at the fully verbal end. A brain can be more cognitive or thinking, or a brain can be more social emotional. Now a certain amount of this is just going to be normal variation. And at what point do you slap a label on it? Because another thing I'm finding is grandparents come up to me all the time, and these grandparents find out they're autistic when the kids get diagnosed.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, because when they were kids, nobody was autistic, or at least labeled that way.
Well, you see, in my generation, social manners and things like that were taught in a much more structured way, in a totally structured way. You were taught to shake hands, taught to say please and thank you, taught to have table manners, and so those grandparents learned that. And so many times this grandparent would be an engineer, an accountant, had decent jobs all their life.
Yeah. Okay. So you've painted a portrait. On one side, there's the socially awkward. On the other side, there's nonverbal. It sounds like it's a line. And then, 328 million people live in the United States today. What percent of people are affected by autism?
Well, it seems to just keep changing and getting more common, but I think a lot of that's just increased detection. Social skills are not taught the same way. Kids are spending more and more time online, even before COVID. I think it's always been there because I've worked in construction for 25 years. I would design a livestock handling facility. I'd supervise its construction and then start it up. So I was out on the construction sites, and I'm going to estimate that about 20% of the really talented, skilled tradespeople that I worked with were either mildly autistic, ADHD, or dyslexic. And I'm saying that completely seriously. I'm talking about people that own metal fabrication companies.
Yeah. I mean, amongst me and my friends, there's a phrase we often use. I don't know rightly or wrongly. We always say, everybody's got something. We say that phrase just to each other. Everybody's got something. We don't mean necessarily an autistic spectrum, but everybody's got something. And you're saying, hey, when I was working on the with the folks that you're working with in the meat industry, 20% demonstrate something along the lines of what you're talking about.
These were the people that built things. They were the welders. They were the machinery designers. And then there would be a guy labeled, his job title was drafting. He would design the whole entire factory. Even though his title was drafting.
Yeah.
He did a ton of engineering that he didn't get credit for.
Yeah. Okay, great. So this is fascinating. There's so many areas in the world of autism I want to explore a little bit further with you, but let's do that through your 3 books. You were kind enough to give it a lot of thought. I really appreciate it. 2 of your books were books I was able to buy and read, or have. One of them I found in my grandmother-in-law's house, actually. I'll tell you about that later. But one of them, the first one that you read as a young child, was a book that we cannot find. So it's called Book About Famous Inventors. And you told me that in 3rd or 4th grade, you read a child's book, a book for children with a short biography of inventors. You compare it to Time Life, American Inventors, A History of Genius single issues. But let's just call the vague, kind of blurry in the past book about famous inventors. So Temple, sorry to interrupt you there. Tell us about your relationship with the book you read as a child about famous inventors.
Well, it was a book that was, definitely a children's book. In fact, it had a sticker that you licked that you'd put on that had a picture of each one of the inventors. And it had Elias Howe, the inventor of the sewing machine, Eli Whitney and the cotton gin, the Wright brothers and the airplane, Goodyear for rubber invention. And it had a little biography of each inventor. And some of these inventors, when they were kids, kind of had problem childhood. Thomas Edison was one of them. I remember his famous quote, it's 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration, when he figured out how to make the light bulb.
I feel like I didn't understand that quote for like 20 years, and then it finally hit me that he meant hard work.
He meant hard work. Exactly. That's what he meant. And I just loved that book. And it was definitely a child's book, designed for 3rd or 4th grade. There's a Smithsonian book of famous inventors that would probably be kind of similar, because since it was a children's book, I'm going to guess that the amount of text it had for each inventor would be like equal to a single page of a regular book. And then it had illustrations and pictures to show what they made. And I just thought that was so fascinating. And my grandfather was an inventor. He was a co-inventor of the autopilot for airplanes.
What's that? What is an autopilot?
Well, when the pilots don't hold the yoke and they don't touch the pedals, it flies the plane.
Right, of course. That's the name of the. I didn't. When you said autopilot, I wasn't picturing that, but of course, of course, that's what it is. Autopilot.
And he and another man, and the other man that my grandfather worked with was probably on the autism spectrum, came up with a totally new idea on how to make an autopilot. And aviation companies thought it was kind of crazy. But it turned out it worked. And my grandfather and this other guy tinkered in a loft over a trolley car garage until they got it to work. So I had talked to him a little bit. So it was 3rd and 4th grade. It was the inventor's book.
Right. And there's some precedent on this podcast for an unnamed book. Molly Bloom who you might know from that movie Molly's Game. She was our guest in chapter 42 of 3 books. And her first book was an unnamed series, kind of like your unnamed series, of women's autobiographies. She remembers reading about things like people like Cleopatra and Mother Teresa, and being inspired by that, kind of like how you were inspired by Thomas Edison and the cotton gin and so on. You brought up your grandfather, and I wasn't sure if I was going to ask you about this because I was thinking in my head, oh, it might be too sensitive, but it's on your Wikipedia profile. So I thought, let me just ask you, Temple, because we've got so we built some trust already a little bit quickly. Your grandfather was an inventor. Your family's very well known in the sort of Boston, Massachusetts area growing up. They were wealthy. Your mother went to Harvard famously, which was very rare at the time, right, for a woman to go to Harvard.
Let me tell you what Mother did. Mother was, of course, it used to be Harvard and Radcliffe. And Mother had me when she only gone to Radcliffe for 2 years. And then she was one of the very first non-traditional students to go back to Harvard when I was 14 to study as an older non-traditional student. She talked the dean into letting her do that and got her degree in English.
Wow. And so this was in the 1940s? 50s?
No, wait a minute. Now, I was born in 1947. This would have been 60s.
Okay. Yeah. But great context. And your mother's portrayed so beautifully in the film, sitting with you at night, 2 hours of training. Once the diagnosis of autism was received in the film, I know it was different in real life. There was recommends for being institutionalized. And what I've read about your background is your mother and father didn't necessarily agree about where you should go, but a lot of investment and resources and time was given to you as a young child as a form of intervention, as a form of getting you to become verbal, right? Because you were nonverbal till I think it was 3 or 4.
Nonverbal till age 4. And
right.
Fortunately, I got into a very good speech therapy school that 2 older teachers taught out of the basement of their home. They had 6 kids in it.
Mm-hmm. In a sphere in the time in the 1950s and 60s that, I'd say Boston. I lived in Boston for a couple of years, went to Harvard, and my memory of it is that it's such an education-oriented town and place. I think more schools in Boston than I think any city in the world except maybe Tokyo. And so you had access to this, and I've heard you preaching about, hey, kids today, early intervention's important, etc. But yet the state of autism around the world, especially for those diagnosed very young, early, is still such a huge variance. Many people, I'm speaking from Canada today, I have a friend who's got 2 autistic children. They're so reliant on kind of broad mass government services where the funding goes up and down depending on who's elected. And resources get pulled, extra help in the classroom is there 1 year and gone the next. For those who live in a system today that are relying on more macro support, what advice do you have for parents listening that might have a child diagnosed or people that are just allies or friends of people that are growing up in the world today, needing special services, but not necessarily having access to that?
Well, in the U.S., it's very variable by state. They vary from excellent to terrible. And I was very lucky to get into very good early intervention at 2.5. And I can't emphasize how important that is. We've got some parts of the U.S. where we are very good on that, other parts where there's no services at all. And what I tell parents, this is when you need to lean on your community group, your church group, get some grandmother volunteers to come in and work with that child. And I have a book called The Way I See It that might be really helpful for that grandmother that might be working with those kids. But the worst thing you could do with a 2-year-old that's not talking is to just let them sit in the corner all day. And you've got to work with these kids when they're little. It's important.
Yeah. And how grateful are we, that is the world, for the intervention and investment you had, because look what happened in terms of all your work, your books, your spokesmanship, etc. So for what it's worth, from the distant future to the distant past, with your mother and her predecessors and your grandfather, like, a huge thank you. Because look, I'm just so both grateful for what you had and also a little bit fearful for what others might have.
Well, it's very variable. I worked with, a lot of these welding people and machinery designers, drafting people. They probably, would have had no speech delay, but they were the kind of, odd loners A kid that often did really badly in school has a big business now, saved by the welding class. One of the worst things the schools have done is taken out hands-on classes.
Yes, I was going to ask you about the saved by the welding class. Keep going.
I am not kidding. Saved by the welding class.
Yeah, and keep going. Hit me with because you go to a fancy school today. What do you see in every room in everyone's hands? Devices, screens, cell phones. I want to put you up on a pedestal right now, and I'm in the parish here. Like, yell at me, scream at me, get me. What is wrong with schools today in terms of how you talk about the cotton gin, you talk about the autopilot, you talk about inventors. There's none of this stuff happening right now.
Well,
my kids watch Paw Patrol.
Well,
they're not watching stuff about inventors like they should be.
We have one program we still have is FFA, Future Farmers of America, and some of our schools have been, keeping those programs. That's really good. But then let's look at other creative things: theater, art, cooking, sewing, woodworking. These are all things that people can turn into careers. And I'm seeing. I'm a visual thinking person. I couldn't do algebra, and I managed to get out of it just by.
You're not the only one.
Just by working in the educational system.
Yeah.
But we need our visual thinkers. In fact,
and our bias in the world today, and especially in education, is just so oriented towards not just specialization, but also towards abstraction, right?
That's
like
right.
Algebra is abstract. The whole thing is to do with letters and numbers that don't exist, Whereas woodworking is like you make a clock and there it is on your shelf.
Well, that's right. You see, as a visual thinker, my world is not abstract. And I'm working right now on a new book on visual thinking and why it's important. Let's look at disasters like Fukushima. I researched Fukushima. I can tell you why it happened.
Tell me. They
did not have waterproof doors to protect the electrically driven emergency cooling equipment from the flood.
Give me a break.
Yes.
In a town right beside the ocean?
Waterproof doors would have saved it. Now, the other thing I have learned in researching Fukushima, there's actually 2 Fukushima nuclear power plants. The one with a disaster with no watertight doors. Another one that was on a little bit higher ground had some watertight doors. Then it had a brilliant manager that took these big cables and made giant extension cords from the one functioning generator to the 3 emergency cooling pumps. He saved it.
And are you about to tell me that he was autistic?
I don't know enough about him to know.
But what a great example of someone using visual learning to develop to what's the word, to like come up with their own tailor-made solution, right?
This isn't a guy that knew every nook. The article about him was in the Harvard Business Review, and they said he knew every nook and cranny of that plant. And to see a visual thinker, I'd think, okay, I got one operating generator, and these are the 3 places I got to get the cables to.
Right. Fantastic, and I really appreciate the push for me and for everyone listening to orient our children and our lives towards more hands-on, because it's so lacking in the world today. And during the pandemic, you notice it because we feed our kids screens. But you are on a fire. So you read this book as a young child, and then a little later on, you stumbled onto a book called Black Beauty: His Grooms and Companions, The Autobiography of a Horse, the 1877 novel by English author Anna Sewell, Sewell. She wrote it in the last few years of her life, where she was living in her house as an invalid. It became an immediate bestseller. She died 5 months after publication, but she lived long enough to see the novel become a success. With over 50 million copies sold, Black Beauty is one of the best-selling books of all time. As I mentioned to you, I bought a copy online because of the pandemic. I like to go to independent bookstores. It came a very small, thin, purple, rubbery cover. It looked like it was printed by a photocopier. It looked like garbage. And then I went to my grandmother-in-law's house, my wife's grandmother, and on the shelf is a hardcover red copy with no copyright date, nothing on the front or back, like an ancient book. She wrote in the inside when she was a child that it belonged to her. And I read that and I felt the magic and beauty of this book. So Temple, please tell us about your relationship with Black Beauty by Anna Sewell. I hope I'm saying that right. Sewell or Sewell.
My mother read a lot of books to me and my sister. And the first reading of that, my mother read it to us. And the thing that I resonated the most with is when they put this horrible harness on the horse that would pull their head way up high to make him look pretty. It was hard for the horse to pull the carriage, and then he fell down and hurt his knees. And I really related to that. That lady was a fashionable lady. All she cared about what the horses looked like, not what they'd feel like trying to pull the carriage. And I just remember that like a picture, like that was just horrible. It was, done to Black Beauty. And that's the scene that I remember the most. Because I find with certain things, there's certain, like almost scenes where I make a picture that I remember.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's other parts of it I don't remember, but there are parts that make a big impression.
Yeah, and you mentioned the animal cruelty, and you mentioned that before I found it and read it myself. I just finished it last night, actually. I've been really enjoying it before bed for the last couple of weeks. It's a wonderful book. I highly recommend everybody read this. But really, the theme of animal welfare, animal cruelty, is throughout the whole book. Black Beauty, the horse, is not only named by different owners throughout the book, but some of them are kind to him and some of them treat him horribly, right? And you get to, for a children's book, it's actually quite graphic and quite painful to read. There's death, there's war, there's a lot that Black Beauty, the horse, goes through. On page 197, Temple, of this book, and everybody will have different page numbers, there was a quote that really jumped out to me. It says this. It's with the character Jerry. I don't know if you remember. Jerry was a great owner that Black Beauty had later in his life, and who called him Jack when he was a cab driver in London. And the owner, Jerry, says, "My doctrine is this, that if we see cruelty or wrong that we have the power to stop, and we do nothing, we make ourselves sharers of the guilt."
Yep, I would agree with that.
And so you're in the top now. Partly the reading of this book now to your work in the animal industry. I won't go so far. I'm a meat eater myself.
I am too.
You are too, and at the same time, I have lots of friends who are prominent animal rights folks. I wish I could say I was one. I just am not, or not yet. Talk to me how this book and also your work today fits into the vein of animal rights and animal cruelty.
Well, as a child, I just thought that, well, you've got to treat them good. And doing that to Black Beauty where he fell down and he injured his knees, that's just awful. I could relate to that. I knew what it was like to fall down and skin my knee. And I assumed Black Beauty might feel the same way about that. And having his head cranked up that high, it'd be hard to pull. I could kind of feel that. And I've always felt very strongly that, animals we use for food, we gotta treat them right. And I remember going into a feed yard one time, and I remember this really well, just as you were reading that thing from Black Beauty, it triggered a memory where there was this person at a feed yard that was just poking cattle with an electric prod, and I just grabbed it away and swore at them. I'm seeing that scene right now.
I'm both amazed at your mind and also sorry for you to re-experience that. There's many scenes in the movie and in your biography I've been reading about you seeing animal cruelty up close, and that being just part of the process of turning animals into food. And so much of your work is to eliminate the cruelty and the pain animals feel in the process of them dying into and being turned into food.
You can get people ask, do they know they're going to get slaughtered? That's a question I had to answer really early on in my career. So I'd go to the Swift meatpacking plant in Arizona. Then I'd go down to a ranch or a feed yard, and I noticed the cattle behaved the same way at both places. They knew they were going to get slaughtered. They'd be very difficult to get into the plant, and they walk in about the same way that they walk in to get a vaccination.
Yeah, and some of what we learned about you designing like curved walking patterns, following a friend, stepping down instead of sliding down into the tank where they get clean. A couple quotes from you, and I don't know if they're from you directly or that were just sort of made for the screen, but you said, "I believe what's good for cattle is what's good for business," because you talked about how there is not as many hurt or injured or the quality of the meat actually is better if they're treated better. And then you also had this quote, "Nature is cruel, but we don't have to be."
Well, and that's something I would have said.
Yeah, but I guess the only question I have, and this is Neil Pasricha, age 40, trying to figure out how vegetarian he should or could or will be. Is it nature that makes us eat the animals we do today? Is it something beyond what we
nature? I'm talking about a predator killing another animal.
Right,
And the
right. And
predator
yeah.
animal kills a prey animal, or a storm comes in and just kills a bunch of animals.
So then I think what I hear you saying, and this is kind of where I net out, is that it's not nature to naturally eat animals, but we do it. Is that like, I mean, I'm saying I eat meat heavily and I feel proud of myself when I make it through a day and I don't eat meat. I try to have a couple of those every week, and maybe it should be more, but your work has been amazing. You have completely transformed the meat industry. There's all this laudatory praise, which I'll add to the beginning of this interview about how you have really changed the entire industry's approach to animal welfare. I love that. What I'm wondering about is, where do you net out now? You're in your 70s today, and you've been working in the industry for decades. Where do you net out today in the growing kind of movement? And I'm not part of this movement, but I feel like I have to. I feel like I need to think about it, Temple. So I want your advice. Is like, how do we think about how much meat to eat, or whether we should eat meat or not? Where does your work
Let
cross
me
into the lines of that?
let me just kind of do a history of what sort of how even starting in the 70s.
Please,
One of
please.
the things I learned in the 70s was all these products that we got from animals that were not meat, like insulin for diabetics.
Mm-hmm.
And I was feeling pretty good that a steer would be 10 days of insulin for a diabetic. So I was feeling pretty good about all the pharmaceutical products and things like that we got from cattle and pigs. Then, just a few years later, in the late 70s, recombinant DNA came on the scene. The first GMO, and the first GMO is not Roundup Ready anything. It is insulin. Because
Sorry,
now,
what's GMO? I apologize.
well,
Oh,
genetic
genetically modified.
genetically modified organism.
Okay,
And
so the first genetically modified organism is insulin.
it's insulin. So they took
Okay.
bacteria and they got the bacteria to make human insulin. So gradually in the 80s, they phased out the insulin from the cattle and the pigs. But now, in order to do that, you had to make a new form of life. And this was one of the very first commercial new forms of life. And it was called recombinant DNA. So that really made me think. I like to ask people that are into environmental stuff what the first GMO is, and they almost always get it wrong, and they'll say it's corn or something like that. Well, it's not. It's insulin.
And when you say made you think what? What did you end up
It made me
thinking?
think
Because
that in order, you see, in order to get rid of the cattle pancreas glands, you had to create a new form of life. Okay. Otherwise, I have two choices to get insulin. I can get it from cattle pancreas glands or pig pancreas glands, or I can get it from a bacteria grown in a lab, which is actually a new form of life.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you see, that's an ethical issue.
How so?
Well,
Like veering towards sort of like AI and making new species and
well, that's just
that type of stuff?
I just got a paper on, I get Nature and Science, and I just saw a paper where there was a monkey brain in a fetus. They'd put special new cells in it, and it was starting to grow big like a human brain.
My instinct is that from a ethical standpoint, using the lab-based insulin would be a lot better than using the insulin from the cows and pigs, just because less cows and pigs are harmed. Am I right or wrong on that?
And that's definitely a legitimate argument. Now, another thing I'm getting interested in is how grazing animals, let's take cattle, goats, sheep, your grazing animals, in certain parts of the U.S., for example, and probably the central part of Canada too, grazing animals created the very, very best farmland in Iowa and Illinois. Grazing animals, if used right, can improve land, improve soil health when you use them right.
And this is why I want to talk to you about this, because there's so much complexity here.
I want to emphasize use them right. If you do grazing wrong, it wrecks the land. You do grazing right with crop rotation, cover crops, do it really right, you can improve the soil health and improve the land. Grazing animals are part of the land, but you got to do it right, and you have to have just the right amount of them.
So I guess part of the reason I like asking you these questions, Temple, is because your depth of knowledge and experience and study and access and awareness, it lets us as listeners to you go beyond the black and white issues of meat eating and into the gray, which of course in every topic there's so much gray. And that's actually part of why I'm running this podcast, is because it lets us go into the gray. And so if I was to ask you, for me, and this is Neil talking, it's not you talking, I'm from a historically very vegetarian background. My mom and dad are East Indian. My mom's from Nairobi, Kenya. My dad's from Amritsar, India. And for financial reasons and access reasons and cultural reasons, I grew up on a largely vegetarian diet. Of course, meat was the premium product. That was the rare product. That was the luxurious product, to have chicken and to have a steak and so on. And so I grew older thinking of meat as a treat. And of course, like all human beings, I guess the hedonic treadmill says we want more treats, or we want to eat. You see this with when populations rise out of poverty in places like China or India, more people end up eating meat. So then the meat consumption goes up. And of course, the negative effects, whether that's methane production or environmental issues, et cetera, goes up too. So I guess I'm asking you from an ethical perspective today. For me, I'm looking personally to eat less meat, but I don't know how to think about that argument. And I'm curious for your thoughts on how much meat we should be eating as a people right now.
Well, let's look at developing countries. A small amount of animal protein, the supplement, like rice and beans, can make a big difference in a child's growth. 1 egg a day, a small amount of meat, it makes a big, big difference in a child's growth.
To the positive.
To the positive, very definitely. And I've looked at some of that research. Now, that doesn't mean you eat a steak a day. But a small amount of animal.
Size of a deck of cards or whatever they say.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. And can make a big difference in the development of young children.
And then as you get to become an adult, do I need meat today to survive? I would say no. Yet, why do I eat it? I like the taste. Is that a good argument? No. I like the protein. Is that a good argument? Maybe. And this is where I get stumbling. That's where I start to stumble mentally into what I do. And I feel like I'm unethical for eating as much meat as I do.
Well, I find that the way my metabolism is, if I don't eat a certain amount of meat, I just feel lousy. And I think there's differences in people's metabolism on how well they can tolerate a vegan diet. I've talked to other lapsed vegans, and they'll say the same thing. And I think there's other people that do just fine on a vegan diet, and it has something to do with metabolism. Because I played around with going vegan when I was in my 20s, and I found I couldn't do it, even if I wanted to. That doesn't mean a pound of steak every day, but I need to have some animal protein every day.
Thank you so much for letting me open that up. I wasn't sure if we could chat about it, but I appreciate that. We had Rich Roll on the show in chapter 45. He's a very prominent vegan, and he's an ultra marathoner. And he goes on to record as saying, when I got rid of meat and milk and these types of animal products, my health and nutrition actually went up to the point where, and he's probably an anomaly, he did a marathon a day on 5 different Hawaiian islands, 5 days in a row. Like he's an ultra marathoner on no meat. And so this is where, you being so close to the industry, I was curious for your perspective on the ethical side. So thank you so much for
I think it's
getting into that a bit.
I think it's differences in the genetics and metabolism. Because there's a lot of people that they've tried going vegan and it just doesn't work for them.
Right. Okay. So we'll stick to one of our policies on the show of trying to be non-judgmental in general as we keep giving ourselves permission to explore a lot of these ideas. The last book that you brought to my attention is a book I had never heard of, that I loved. Another book I loved, and it is called The Invisible Pyramid by Loren Eiseley. Loren is Loren, and Eiseley is Eiseley. He lived from 1907 to 1977. He's a very famous American anthropologist, educator, philosopher, and natural science writer who taught and published books through the 50s all the way up to the 70s after getting a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. So very prominent nature writing. I'm holding the book in my hand. It is black. It is shiny. It's published from the University of Nebraska Press. It doesn't look like it's selling a ton today, yet I found this book so mentally expanding. On the back it says, in 1910, young Loren Eiseley watched the passing of Halley's Comet with his father. The boy who became a famous naturalist was never again to see the spectacle except in his imagination. That childhood event contributed to the profound sense of time and space that marks this book, The Invisible Pyramid. It's a collection of essays first published shortly after Americans landed on the moon, exploring inner and outer space, the vastness of the cosmos, and the limits of what can be known. Bringing poetic insight to scientific discipline, Isley makes connections between civilizations past and present, multiple universes, humankind, and nature. A wonderfully fascinating, mind-expanding, as David Mitchell would say, vertiginous book. The cover's got an abstract photo of dandelion. It's blowing into the wind. Temple, please tell us about your relationship with the incredible book, The Invisible Pyramid by Lauren Isley.
Well, when I was reading this book, I've got a different version of it. I've got the Scribner version. It's got a copyright in 1970, and it has kind of like a cosmos on the cover of it. I've got it here in front of me, looking at some marked up sections of it. And I was a young person in my 20s thinking about, what is the meaning of life? What's it all about? And I remember reading this chapter called The Spore Bearers. And it talked about a certain kind of spore that would put a great big tower up and then send out a bunch of spores. And Lauren Isley was kind of comparing that to our sending a person to the moon. And were we going to just, it was sort of like the spore cities grow, they put up this big tower, they do this great achievement, and then things kind of decay. And it really made me think. Another interesting thing is I found a newspaper article I'd stuck inside this book, because this book had sit on my shelf for years. And then when I was going to do the book's view, I went and looked it up, and I found an article in the Arizona Republic, because I was in Arizona, July 17th, 1977, that I'd stuck inside this book, and it was about New York City's fragile social fabric torn by a blackout, and the electricity had gone off. I sort of got thinking about, what's going to happen to us after we've done this great achievement? Do we keep achieving? And then I underlined with squiggly lines and a star on my page 90, science has risen in a very brief interval into a giant social institution of enormous prestige and governmentally supported power. To many, it replaces the primitive magic as a solution to all human problems. And I have that underlined 3 times. And it was something that as a young person that really made me think. I have kept a lot of my other books. I've moved now 3 times. They got lost. This book I kept.
Wow. What an incredibly intimate relationship you have with this book. Did you mention, or did I miss how it came into your life in the first place?
I'll be perfectly honest, I don't remember. It might have been a gift. I might have seen it in a bookstore. That I don't remember. But I can remember the coffee shop I would sit in when I was reading it.
And where was that? Was that in Arizona?
It was in Arizona, a little coffee shop that served yogurt, ice cream, and that was outside of Arizona State University. And I don't remember how I got it.
Page 1 of the book includes a quote that reflects what you just said as the squiggly quote. He says, "As an anthropologist, I know that we exist in the morning twilight of humanity, and I pray that we may survive its noon." So you said it made you think about that, and there was an article from the New York Blackout about how people fell into savagery.
I put that article from the New York Blackout in this book, and I did that back in the 70s.
And so now how do you think about that? So you've raised the question, Lauren Isley's raised the question about our survival long-term, our species survival. How do you think that will play out? You won't be here, I won't be here, Temple, but take us forward 100 to 500 to 1,000 years, as Lauren Isley does, and think of us as the spore eaters, as you called us, or that he called us. Well, how do you think it's going to play out?
Well, civilizations rise. They'll get to the pinnacle. You look back through history, you can see that, and then another civilization takes over. That's always happened.
And are we at the pinnacle? Have we passed it? Are we going to hit there in 500 years? Where are
that's the $1 million question.
Yeah.
So I just kind of, when you asked me my favorite books, the Inventor book came up right away in my mind, and then the Black Beauty right away. And then I got to thinking, well, let's look at a book that, as a young person, and I would have been, the article that I stuck in is 1977. So all I know is I read it when I was living in Arizona, because that was part articles in the Arizona Republic, and I would have been in my 20s.
Yeah, and you make a good point, though. Just even the idea, and Lauren mentions this, you mentioned this, that there is a pinnacle that you hit and you come down. To be honest, I felt he was quite pessimistic in this book. Even though I feel like I'm optimistic, I still found the book so mind-expanding. The idea that, the first thing he does is rail against the idea that we've claimed the cosmos, marking with some simple language how really vast and far they are and how we are actually trapped in this prison. He calls it a cosmic prison. I want to talk to you a little bit about aging. You are, I don't know, I know there's septuagenarian. Is that what you call somebody in their 70s?
Yeah, and I'll be 73 in the end of August.
Yeah. Oh, this is amazing. And my father's 75, and so I have a couple septuagenarians in my life. On page 22 of the book, Lauren writes, I, like others of my generation, was born in an age which has already perished. At my death, I will look my last upon a nation which, except for some linguistic continuity, will seem alien and remote. It will be as though I peered upon my youth through misty centuries. I will not merely be old, I will actually be a genuine fossil embedded in onrushing man-made time just before my actual death. Now, he died at age 69 in 1977, so he never got to become a septuagenarian. But you were lucky enough to become one. I hope I become one too. How do we get older better? How do we think about ourselves as he calls them living fossils?
What we got to do is encourage the younger generation. I figured that's my job. Well, one of my really good friends sent me a picture of an elephant. And the old matriarch elephants, they know where all the food is. I also tore this other article out of the Science magazine. It was about old killer whales that are female killer whales that are past their, they no longer can reproduce, but they're very valuable because when food is scarce, they can find it. They're valued for their knowledge. Well, I cut that out and I put it up on my wall. And
the elephant's the same as the orca, you're saying?
Same thing. And the other thing that I have, if we were doing a Zoom conference, is I've got a Hubble Space Telescope poster. And one of the most important pictures that Hubble ever took was a deep space field. And you look at that and you see hundreds of galaxies.
Yes.
And
it's one of my favorite pictures. I even put a picture of that in my book, The Happiness Equation.
Well, I read a book that's just come out that described the history of that deep space field picture. And NASA almost turned it down because they thought it was ridiculous that you want to spend your precious observing time pointing the Hubble at absolutely nothing. I know it's a spot of absolutely nothing next to the Big Dipper. Well,
so for those that
they saw all those galaxies.
Yes. For those that don't know, what you're talking about is that they pointed the Hubble telescope for a long period of time at what appeared to be nothing, a distant sort of pinprick of blackness in the universe. When the picture and the exposure was opened as far as possible, as long as possible, as deep as possible, what came back was an incredible, I've seen it online as a big poster of thousands upon thousands of galaxies. Again, not of solar systems, not of planets, not of stars, but entire galaxies, each of which containing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of stars, each or more or less, but vast circular galaxies and spinning galaxies and things that look like seashells and things that look like atoms. And Jerry Seinfeld famously hung this poster above the writing room at Seinfeld because he said, whenever we got stressed writing jokes for George Costanza, he said, look at the picture, guys. It doesn't matter. Like nothing matters. We are floating in space here. Judd Apatow, famous movie director for movies like Knocked Up, he's gone on the record as saying, that picture actually gives me so much anxiety. I feel like nothing. I feel like my life is meaningless. So where do you come out on that? And you mentioned finding food for younger people and teaching the younger generation. How does that give you a sense of purpose? And how does the picture you're talking about give you a sense of purpose here?
It makes me feel good when my students go out and have good careers. And I've had some really good students. And I figure as an older person now, one of my jobs is to encourage the younger generation to and get them interested in stuff where, it can, really do some good. Um, it's that's what you do when you're older.
So one way to find purpose as we age is to constantly be helping the younger generation and feeling like we're part of the future of our species.
Well, I also do a lot of autism talks, and I've got some emails that I printed out and taped on the wall, and one was from a parent. Their kid, they said, "Oh, I did what you suggested. Get my kid out doing things. He's got a job. He got married. He got a house. Thank you so much for getting me to get my kid out doing things." And that's the kind of thing that makes my day. That's something that I said in the talk. This kid's out in a career rather than playing video games in the basement because nobody got him out doing things.
Right. It's beautiful. Something else jumped out to me from this book around the value of life. Just a second. Let me pull up the quote here if I can find it. He says, the ideas are fantastically wasteful, but so is life. It would be sufficient if the proper planetary conditions were discovered once in 1,000 times. And he goes on to talk about cyborgs and machine structures that will emerge from the human brain in the future. I guess I was teased or tempted by reading this book to keep asking you questions about it, but how do you mentioned the insulin as an example of man-made intervention to create life in the 1980s. You're very close to the meat industry and the creation, I'm assuming, as part of your industry of like creating meat in labs and so on. And now you're living in an age today where we have things like, organ transplants where the organ could be grown in a lab.
That's right.
Right. And so where does this go from here? At the time of this recording, new AI languages are being created and put out by companies created by people like Elon Musk that purportedly let us communicate and interact in natural languages with non-human brains, GPT-3 and so on. I guess in my mind, I'm a bit worried about this, but I don't know if I should be. And how do you think about the
Elon
integration
Musk is one of the people who's actually got some concerns about some of this artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
He says that the technology is moving so fast that we may not completely understand it. Now, I think back to the movie, The Space Odyssey, when Hal gets disconnected. And Hal very logically thought, kill the astronauts, that'd be the best thing to do for the mission. Well, fortunately, Hal had an off switch. You know what's another thing that was fortunate is that spacesuit was not one of the Internet of Things. Otherwise, Hal would have shut off the spacesuit's oxygen supply.
Right.
No, and I think that for a lot of important infrastructure like electric power grid, a lot of industrial equipment, really important stuff, you've got to have mechanical devices that will either shut it down or stop something from spinning too fast and wrecking a big generator. I'd put mechanical safeguards on there so even if it's hacked or if Hal goes crazy, you can't destroy some big chemical factory or something really, really, really bad if it got destroyed.
Yeah, like a door you have to open, a switch you have to turn. I'm picturing like, in the movies when they go into like the secret chambers and stuff, but you're saying hardwired. And I often hear even simple advice from people much smarter than me saying, cover up the camera on your computer and try to work offline and, use DuckDuckGo as a browser, not Google Chrome necessarily, because your internet history won't be tracked. And at the same time though, Temple, don't you feel like we give away all of our privacy sort of purposely for just an extra like app or hack or life efficiency? Like we are so desperate to, have geo-targeted ads give us $1 off a cold cut trio at Subway that will gladly let companies create databases that follow our locations around, no problem.
I treat everything online as public, period. Every email, everything is public.
Well, it's wonderful to hear that advice because I feel the same way. It's like either it's public or it's not, but then be very aware of what you're doing. It's a gift to spend time with you, to talk to you, to hear about the 3 books that were most formative to you as you have turned into an incredible leader of the world. As we close off, there's a lot of people listening right now. Of course, our audience is people that aspire to read more or to read better. So there's hundreds of thousands of people listening around the world, looking to you as someone who's written a ton of great books, but also been a great student of the world and a great advocate for those looking to follow your footsteps, either in advocacy or writing or being a spokesperson for a cause that's not well understood right now, like you were in the 80s for autism. What advice would you leave us with, or what kind of final word or two would you kind of give back to feed or to find the food for the young orcas out there?
Well, there's different kinds of thinking, and I wrote about that in my book, The Autistic Brain. You've seen in the movie, and we've talked on this interview about how I am a visual thinker. Everything's in pictures. Then another kind of thinker is a more mathematical visual spatial. So you have the object visualizer like me who thinks in pictures, and then you have the visual spatial, and there's science to back this up. And then there's some people that are very, very much word thinkers. And the first thing you got to understand is that different thinkers exist, and the skills can complement each other. And as I've been learning more and more, if you can learn how to communicate with each other, you can go, well, this person would be really good at doing this part of the experiment. All right, let's just take, high school robotics program, a robotics project. Well, I would build the mechanical robot, and the other mathematician's going to program it. Or you take your iPhone. Steve Jobs was an artist. That's why it's easy to use. Mathematicians had to make the phone actually work. You see, that's an example of the different minds working together. And so that's something I'm very interested in, is taking the things that kids are good at, and let's build them into careers, build them into things where they can go out and make the world a better place.
And you do that so well. I'm so honored that you've come on the show. Temple Grandin, thank you so much for coming on 3 Books.
Well, thank you for having me.
Hey everybody, it is just me. It is just Neil again, hanging out at home, not in my basement with my backpack full of wires, but today, upstairs in my wire-filled office with a mattress leaning on the wall beside me, as this used to be a bedroom when we were able to leave the house / have guests. Oh, how was that for you? How was listening to one of Time Magazine's 100 most influential people, one of the biggest advocates in the world for the autistic community, one of the leading scientists, prominent science out there, talking about how, Fukushima basement is no big deal. Could have used waterproof doors if you don't want to prevent a nuclear meltdown. I love listening to her. She distills big, complex, interesting thoughts into simple things, and her mind, which thinks in pictures, as we saw and felt right at the beginning, right? She's talking about driving over 2 feet of magma in Hawaii. Like, it's a beautiful brain. So it's just a fun to play and listen and to, hang out with a mind like that. I feel that way. I love that. I'm so grateful to Temple for giving us 3 more books that we're going to add to our top 1,000. For new listeners that you may not know, head over anytime to 3books.co, that's 3books.co, and click the top 1,000. That is a list of every formative book ever discussed on this show. So we are going to add number 821, an unnamed book on inventors. So this one will not have a link, does not have an author. It's similar to a book we had on from Molly Bloom. You guys remember back in chapter 42. But it is the actual book. Temple said, hey, if you want a link off Amazon, I'll give you a different book. I don't want that. I want the book that was formative to her. And we do not even have a bias that book must have a title. We know it had stickers. We know it had a cotton gin. We know it had Thomas Edison. That's enough. I think if you wanted to find a book on inventors, you were interested in that, you could find many of them today. She also gave us number 820, The Incredible Black Beauty by Anna Sewell. That's Sewell. If you have not read Black Beauty, I implore you to. That book was revolutionary on so many levels. Obviously, it's written from the perspective of a horse, but it just flies up and down and sideways, experiencing so many pains and pleasures through the eyes of a beautiful animal. And number 819, The Invisible Pyramid by Lauren Isley. That's Eiseley. Again, Read this book. This is a book I read and loved. If you are an environmentalist, a naturalist, a humanity lover, a philosopher, a humanist, if you are a leader of a company, you got to read this book, The Invisible Pyramid. The essays are mind-blowing. When we were talking about the Hubble telescope, like zooming out into pitch blackness, I didn't know that about NASA potentially canceling that. Interesting insight from Temple. If that gave you a sense of vertigo or a sense of awe or if you felt a sense of like, what is this? What's bigger? If you liked our chapter with Pete Holmes, where we talk about some of these bigger things, like where are we? What is the universe? What's beyond that? If you like people like Pete Holmes, that's chapter 40. If you like people like Tim Urban, chapter 22, then you will love this book, The Invisible Pyramid by Lauren Isley. I cannot recommend it enough. And with that, a huge thank you to Miss Temple Grandin. That's 3 taps on the microphone. Maybe that's what I'll start doing when I say, hey, are you still here? If you are, I'd like to welcome you back to the end of the podcast club. Yes, this is one of 3 clubs that we have for 3 books listeners, together with the Cover to Cover Club. That's anybody who tries to listen to every single chapter of the show, 333, over multiple decades, people. And the Paper Cut Club, that is our secret club, analog only, through the mail. Can't say more, other than you got to call our phone number to learn more about it. That's 1-833-READ-A-LOT. Yes, we have a phone number. Yes, it's accessible anywhere in the world. If not, just send me or somebody on our team. Manuela. Manuela is our pod maestro. Send me or Manuela, our email addresses are on the website, a little email or a voice note. Why would you do that? Well, maybe you want to call in for the end of the podcast club. That is this club. That is the 3rd club, but also was the 1st club where you talk directly to me. I talk directly to you. We play your voicemails. We read your letters. We talk about a word of the podcast. And we always start off. How do we start off, people? By going to the phones.
Hey, Neil, this is Aykut. I'm calling from San Francisco, California. I originally from Turkey. I first listened you about what you're doing at Farnham Street. Then after that, I've been following your blog, and that was, I think, 69 days ago. And then that's the reason I've been writing my own daily journal last 69 days. You're truly inspiration to me. So I was going to ask you, what makes you to write a book after you wrote it like 1,000 days, or you were always thinking about writing a book when you first started, or what makes you keep writing while you didn't give up? Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to Eichard from San Francisco via Turkey for calling in. I have this fetish in my brain. I just love different voices. I love voices. So if you have an interesting or unique background or accent or way of speaking, call me. Please call me. I love voices. I feel so much texture through the voices. What did I read? Some article in Scientific American once talking about how so much communication comes through voice. You can get my mood through the voice. You can get my facial expression through the voice. You can get my facial expression. See what I mean? Voices communicate so much. I love your voice. Eichard. Farnham Street. How cool that you heard about me through Farnham Street. Yes, indeed. I was the featured guest over on the Knowledge Project, Shane Parrish's podcast, over on episode number 72. If you want to hear Shane interviewing me instead of me interviewing Shane, then head on over to the Knowledge Project and check out episode number 72, where Neil Pasricha shares the recipe for resilience, an antidote for anxiety, and how his 2-minute morning routine primes each day for success. Yes, that is breathless prose from the incredible Shane Parrish. I love 1,000-point projects. I didn't quite catch yours on their chart. I couldn't check. I couldn't figure out where yours was online. But one that I've been finding cool lately is from a young man in India. He's in his early 20s. I think he lives in Calcutta, and he sent it to me. It's called 80K Point Project. Again, it's number 80, the letter K and Point Project. It's at Instagram, so it's at 80K Point Project. He also heard about me through Farnham Street, and he writes a little essay every day trying to teach himself something. What do you say after sorry? What do you do if you don't feel like writing? what's going to happen at the end of the lockdown? What's the best way to learn anything? And he writes like little prose essays to himself that are very, very interesting and counterintuitive. I wish I had a mind like that when I was in my 20s. What a small world. And as for the book, no, I didn't know 1000awesomethings.com would turn into the Book of Awesome. However, I did put a lot of care and thought and time into every single essay. So my advice, if you're doing a big project like that, is don't worry about the output. You can't necessarily control what happens in terms of it being published and so on, but you can control how good it is and focus on that input. Use that intrinsic motivator as a part of your success. I mean, look, as I'm recording this to you now, I just spent a whole day on one sentence for my new book. A whole day. I'm not kidding. Like, I actually sat on a park bench in the shade working on a sentence. Now, it's a long sentence. It was like a 300-word sentence. It was a very, very long sentence. However, I spent a whole day on it, on one sentence. So will I ever be paid for that sentence? Will that ever be in a book? Well, I don't know. I can't think of it that way. All I can think about is that is the best sentence I could have written, and it's an awesome sentence if I do say so myself. And if you're willing to wait for the book that it comes out in a couple of years, I think it'll be worth the wait, but I can't control when or if it does, okay? Focus on inputs, not on outputs. All right. And now it is time for the letter of the chapter. And this chapter's letter comes from Angie B. Angie Beck, actually. And she says, "Hi, Neil. I've been meaning to email you since my trip to Key West last June. Until I listened to the episode with Judy Blume, Chapter 6, I did not know that she had a bookstore in Key West. It just so happened that I listened to the episode about 2 weeks before my trip, so I made plans to put the bookstore on my itinerary. When I got there, I asked if Judy Blume was there, but she wasn't. At the time, she was in Miami with her husband, George. Anyway, it's definitely a beautiful, quaint little bookstore, and I ended up purchasing one of her autographed books, as well as an Ernest Hemingway biography. I visited his home while I was there too. Thank you so much for the podcast. I really enjoy it." Angie Beck. And there's a whole bunch of photos of her at Books and Books in Key West, Florida, where of course I was in Chapter 6. Why did I read this letter now? Because I miss traveling and going to stores and going to bookstores and being on a beach. I landed in Key West, Florida in my suit. I flew down there just for a few hours. I gave a speech in Miami for like a big company. I think it was Volvo. And then I flew down to Key West at like noon to interview Judy Blume at like 2. Then I flew back to Miami. And then I flew back home to Toronto, all in like the same day. So it was a crazy day. I was in my suit. I was sweltering. I landed in Key West and I'm like, gotta book it. Get to the bookstore. Judy Blume is wonderful and kind. And as you heard, if you listen to Chapter 6, if you are in the Cover to Cover Club, she gave us a tour of her store over audio, which I thought was just so fun and so cool. If you haven't heard that chapter, I implore you to go back, at least listen to the last 15 minutes where Judy Blume walks us around her bookstore, giving us a guided tour. Hooray for Judy Blume. Hooray for Angie Beck. Hooray for going to independent bookstores. Okay. And now it is time for the letter of the chapter. And for this, wait. It's not time for the letter. It is time for the word of the chapter. Get it straight, Pasricha. And for this chapter's word, let's head back to Temple Grandin.
Well, when the pilots don't hold the yoke and they don't touch the pedals, it flies the plane.
Yes, indeed, it is yoke. Yoke. That is Y-O-K-E, not to be confused with yolk, Y-O-L-K, which is, of course, the yellow stuff in an egg. Y-O-L-K is the yellow stuff in an egg. We're not talking about that. We're not talking about that, and neither was Temple. She's talking about yoke, Y-O-K-E. Couple things on this word. First off, fascinating. I always look at the Google trend. I don't really mention to you guys much because who cares? It's the word's used a lot or a little over time. But this one is really interesting. For the word yoke, it was used a lot in the 1800s, not that much in the 1850s, then really not at all in the 1900s, and then nothing in the 1950s, and then pretty much nothing at all in the 2010. And then suddenly in the past little couple years, it's like uptick. Why? No one knows. The definition, number 1, a wooden cross piece fastened over the necks of 2 animals attached to the plow or cart that they are to pull. Okay, so there's pictures of cows. They have these 2 giant kind of metal harnesses connecting their heads together, and so they can like pull you, with a bucket of hay to the silo. Okay, clearly I have no idea what I'm talking about. But that is the primary definition of yoke, not the definition that Temple was using. But I just wanted to let you know, if you wondered what those things are called on 2 horses or 2 cattle, that's what it's called. Then it's used metaphorically second most often. Like, for example, the yoke of imperialism. So it's used to reference something in general that is regarded as oppressive or burdensome. Interesting. Similar words are like dominate, enslave, tyranny. Okay. Then number 2, it could also be called the part of a garment that fits over the shoulders and which the main garment is attached, like in the gathers or the pleats. It's the yoke of a shirt. Okay. Number 3 is a frame fitting over the neck and shoulders of a person, used for carrying pails or buckets. Okay, you know when people have those big sticks over their shoulders and they're carrying stuff? That is indeed a yoke. It could also be, number 4, the crossbar at the head of a rudder whose ends ropes are fastened to. Crossbar at the head of a rudder. Guys, I don't know how to sail. I don't know what this definition is talking about. And then number 5, the last definition, which is, there's a tag on it. It's only North American. North American. It's a control lever in an aircraft. So the definition that Temple used and the one that I was like, what does that mean? And then, oh yeah, of course I know what that means. Well, I really had no idea what it meant. And apparently not many people do, because there's 5 completely different definitions, from a yoke over the necks of 2 animals to the yoke of imperialism to the parts of your shirt that attach at the top to the thing you carry over your neck to carry like buckets of water to the crossbar and a rudder to all the way to a control lever in an aircraft. People, if you want to drop a yoke, Y-O-K-E, in a sentence, well, now you know how. Can you believe where we are? Chapter 61, and we are having lots of fun. New Kids on the Block reference for all y'all. Listen, I'm loving this. I'm enjoying it. It's been a weird summer, to say the least, guys. It has been a weird year. I'm not on the team of like end 2020 or 2020 is can't. I'm not one of those people. Okay, you don't expect that from me. I don't believe that is true. I think every day we have is precious. And when I scream at my kids, or I wake up with a headache, or I can't get out of bed, yeah, I think this day is precious, and I get myself going, because it is. So have a cold shower, fill your brain with inspiring words, as you just did. Get yourself going, take a deep breath, give your kids a hug, give your parents a hug, call your mom, call your partner, reach out and touch someone. Okay. And we're going to be okay. We're going to be okay. And from March 27th, when the trailer of this show is dropped on 2018, all the way up to September 1st, 2031, I will be your partner, your co-pilot. You are driving, I'm in shotgun. I am driving, you are in shotgun. We are taking a 333 chapter trip around the minds, hearts, and bodies of the world together. It is an absolute pleasure to have you with me on this gigantic, wild ride. Thank you so much for listening. And until next time, let's remember that you are what you eat, and you very much are what you read. Keep turning that page, and I'll talk to you soon. Take care.